My name is Lenny Zeltser. I'm the CISO at Axonius and the faculty fellow at SANS Institute. And over spending more than a couple of decades in cybersecurity industry, I've realized that the key for me to succeeding with security projects is asking the right questions in the right way and at the right time. And that's what I'd like to share with you in this presentation. Because we often hesitate to ask questions. I know I often feel self-conscious asking questions because I don't want to feel ignorant or foolish sometimes. And so I have to keep reminding myself that it is through questions that I can close information gaps. It is through questions that I can uncover risks, find interesting solutions to security problems, and very importantly, build rapport with people with whom I'm collaborating. Because as security professionals, we often always collaborate with other stakeholders in our activities. And it is very interesting that through the research that I have read on this topic, there's this theme that if you ask questions in a particular way, you will be successful at getting others to appreciate you, to like you, to respect you. The key is asking questions in a particular way, and that is what I wanted to share with you by bringing up a bunch of examples and sharing with you some stories as well as research on this topic. And I'll start out with an infamous book by Dale Carnegie when he wrote his famous volume, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And he said, to be interesting, be interested. Ask questions. And there is this key here to be interested in others when you ask questions. You genuinely have to want to know what is it that they're trying to say to inform your own ideas and to inform your participation in discussions. So what I wanted to do here is to group the types of activities that I think we all participate in into three categories. I'll first discuss with you what might be the right way to ask the right questions at the right time when it comes to activities where we discover certain things. Then we'll talk about questions related to planning activities. And finally, I'll discuss with you questions that you might need to ask when you're trying to persuade others to take a particular course of action or to support your opinion. So let's get started. We'll start with discover. When I say discover, I'm talking about activities such as gaining situational awareness for perhaps a new position that you have taken on in your organization or perhaps in another. You want to know what's going on here and what am I doing here? Maybe you want to assess the nature of security controls that you're responsible for, that you're trying to strengthen. Maybe you're trying to perform a vulnerability assessment. Maybe you're involved in incident response and you need to understand what's going on in this environment that may have been compromised. And perhaps you're also asking questions in a different capacity when looking at the vendors that participate in your company's information technology, and you need to understand what risks they might pose to your organization. So lots of questions are involved in activities related to discovery. So let's think about what is the best way to pose a question. I wanted to start with this example. So I know that people who are listening to this talk take on different types of security responsibilities. But here, let's imagine that we're trying to understand security measures related to the standard for security programs, ISO 27001. Look at this question and think, how would you determine whether this is the best way to pose a question like this? The question is, which controls support ISO 27001 Annex Requirement 8.2 for information classification? How do you know if this is the right way to pose such a question? Well, a lot depends on whether your audience for this question understands what you're talking about. Are they familiar with ISO 27001? Do they know this thing called 8.2 Annex Requirement? Are they familiar with the notion of information classification? You see, if you use a jargon that alienates the other party, then they will just reject your question. They might not answer it, or even worse, they might answer your question incorrectly and you might not even realize it. On the other hand, you need to use the right terminology so that your audience, whoever is receiving your question, understands that you know what you're talking about. So this idea that the way that you ask your question depends on how your audience understands the terms you're using. That's the key to asking the right questions. And depending on certain situations, if you think that your audience doesn't understand your jargon, or if you're not even sure what does this person know and don't know about the subject matter, your best bet might be to ask an open-ended question. So for example, in this case, in this example, maybe it would be better, if you're not sure about your audience knowledge and the terminology they prefer to use, maybe it's better to use an open-ended question like, please tell me about your approach to classifying information. And then depending on how they answer this open-ended question, you will hear the types of terms they use, the way they think about information, and their answers will reveal their familiarity with the subject, and therefore will shape your follow-up questions, because you can then mirror to them the kind of terms they use, the way that they speak about the subject matter in your follow-up questions. So remember I said that Dale Carnegie said to be interesting, be interested, ask questions. This means listen to the answers to your questions so that the answer informs your subsequent questions. Something else to consider if you're trying to gather a lot of information is whether you should start with the most difficult, the most confrontational, the most intrusive question, or whether it's better to start with an easy question and then ramp up the sensitivity of your questions. Well, there's some research that I read on the topic, and by the way, at the end of this presentation, I will show you the article names of various papers and references that support some of the ideas that I'm sharing with you. But I read research that showed that if you truly want to get answers in a very tough situation, you might be better off asking the most intrusive question first to just shock your other party into thinking critically about the problem and set the bar high for the kind of questions you're going to be answering. For example, if you're trying to understand the security posture of the organization, a tough, intrusive question might be, what is the biggest concern you have about the existing compromise in your environment? I don't know, something like that, something that really worries the other party. Such an intrusive question might be difficult to hear in the beginning, but it'll allow you to set the bar and frame the rest of your conversations so that the subsequent questions are easier, and that way the person might end up opening up more. However, the same researchers found out that if that's how you choose to begin asking your questions, then it'll be a very difficult conversation that perhaps will not contribute towards building a strong, lasting relationship with the other party. And if you're planning to work together, if this is a colleague with whom you're going to be spending at least a few years in the same workplace, then it is actually more effective in the longer term to ease into the conversation, start with light questions, and then gradually escalate their sensitivity. So, as I just shared with you, the key to asking questions is hearing the answer and informing your follow-up questions based on how the person talked about the subject matter and how they answered, what terms they used in response to your question. Now, another reason why this is so important is because the other party is paying attention, whether you are paying attention. And if all of your questions are disjointed, if you've prepared your questions in advance, and if you just ask them one at a time without demonstrating that you really are listening, then the other party will realize that you maybe are not all that interested in what they're trying to say. You might be interested, but they need to see that. And the way that they will see that, the way that you demonstrate that you're paying attention to them, is by informing your subsequent questions about what they've said. Sometimes researchers call this being responsive to the other person or to the other situation. This helps establish rapport. And by asking questions informed by previous answers, you're showing that you're more responsive, you're building rapport with the other party, and frankly, the other party generally enjoys conversing with you more in these kinds of responsive interactions. Now, let's look at another question and think about what about it might be counterproductive. The question is, why have you failed to follow server hardening requirements? That's a pretty tough question. It's very confrontational, isn't it? The other person might feel attacked and right away start being defensive. What makes this question particularly difficult to hear is the word you, because you're saying, what have you done? Why have you done this? The word you amplifies the perceived attack. And unless your goal is really to agitate the other party, which probably is unlikely, you're better off avoiding attacking other people with whom you're trying to collaborate, and instead adjust your question so that it focuses on the situation and the desired outcome. So how might you reword this question with this in mind? How about this possibility? You could say something like this: the server's configuration does not meet our security requirements. How might we address this situation now and prevent it in the future? You see, I'm careful not to attack the person. I'm talking about the problem that I have with the current situation. And I'm also explaining what I want to happen in response to my question. I'd like to find out how to address this problem right away and how to prevent it in the future. So I'm cooling down the tone of my question here. Now, there are some situations that are very urgent, like if you're in the process of dealing with an active compromise and the adversary is spreading within the organization, you must hurry, you must act now, you must get others to realize that this is something that they should be paying attention to and take seriously. In that case, the tone of your question will be urgent and hot. I would still avoid personal attacks, but you might need to ramp up the tone of your question. But in most cases, we're better off cooling things down, avoiding direct confrontation, and talking about the situation, and very importantly, what you want to happen in response to your question. But these situations where incident response is involved, they oftentimes are a reason why people are stressed. And so look at this question. How would you know whether this is the right way to ask the question in a given situation? And my question here is, in an incident response scenario, what do we know so far about what happened? Earlier in this talk, I suggested that it's nice, if you're not sure about your audience, to begin with an open-ended question like that. But there's a problem with open-ended questions, which is that sometimes the question is too open-ended. And people of whom you're asking this question might not know how to answer it. They might not have the mental framework, because of their experience or lack of thereof, for example, to provide an adequate answer. And very importantly, I found that if you pose an open-ended question when the person is stressed out, when they're very nervous, then they just don't know how to properly respond to it. So what I've learned is that if the situation is urgent, if there's a lot of stress, then I want to guide the other party through answering my question. And so I don't ask an open-ended question in that case. I provide more specific questions, offering some extra guidance to the way that I want the question to be answered. And therefore, I found that when I'm dealing with stressful situations, situations where people are likely to make a mistake because of just the nature of the problem we're trying to solve here, I found that it's very useful to organize my thoughts using a checklist. So I come prepared, if I can, with a set of questions I should consider asking. Now, remember, earlier I said that you want to make sure that the other party feels that you're not just bombarding them with prepared questions, one after the other. They want to see a theme to your questions. They want to see that your questions are informed by their answers. So I'm not just going to be asking these questions one after another blindly, but I come in with some specific questions that can guide me in asking them specifics, and then depending on the answers, I might choose to omit certain questions, or eventually, if I see that we've established the right rapport and the stress has come down, I might resort to asking open-ended questions. So these are the thoughts that come to my mind when I think about questions that I ask in discovery type situations. And what I discussed with you so far is that you need to understand your audience so that you ask your questions on their terms. I suggest that one way to get to know your audience is to open up with open-ended questions. At the beginning, you might say something like, what do we know about the situation? And by the way, you can also wrap up your conversation with an open-ended question too, something like, is there anything I should have asked that I didn't? That can reveal some additional answers. I also highlighted the need for your questions to be relevant to the situation, responsive to the person, and also I explained that your questions should account for the context within which your person is answering your questions. And I suggested that especially in stressful situations, you should look at checklists that you prepare in advance to guide your conversation and to minimize the chances that open-ended questions might lead to incomplete or wrong answers. Next, I wanted to discuss with you questions in the context of planning. Yeah, we do a lot of planning in information security. For example, we might be planning a way to address a risk, fix a vulnerability, deal with a policy non-compliance, prevent some dangerous situation. We might plan when we look for goals for our security projects and programs. And another context, maybe we're planning the right features of a product we're building or an internal tool that we're creating. So a whole lot of planning takes place in the world of information security. Let's talk about questions that can help you plan. Because a lot of security activities go beyond yourself, your immediate team, and they account on the cooperation and input from others. So consider a situation where you're a security person talking to an application owner, and maybe the application has a security weakness. And maybe you ask this question: when will you design a way to minimize the data exposure of this application? You're talking to the application owner. There is some concern over data exposure. When will you design a way to minimize that risk? How might you strengthen this question? What are the weaknesses in this question? Maybe you've picked up already, based on something I shared with you earlier, that this question could be perceived as being confrontational. The other person might feel like they're being attacked. So that's one aspect of the question that I would like to correct. But also, my concern over this question is that it places the burden solely on the other person to figure out a way to solve this problem. And you know what? If it was easy to solve data exposure risks, maybe they would have been addressed already. So in many cases, as security professionals, we walk into the situation and should be willing to offer some insights. Now, we've got to be careful to not make other people's problems solely our own responsibility. So I'm not saying you come into the situation and say, I'll fix everything for you, I'll tell you what to do. That's not the right way to handle it as well. But my point is that we might need to be more collaborative than not in many cases. So how about this way of rephrasing this question? What I would say is, how might we design a way to minimize the data exposure of the application? How might we? That's how I'm opening this question. This specific way of starting a question is sometimes called collaborative framing. It asks the question in a way that makes it clear that we are both, or all of us in this conversation, going to think about a problem. And this way of asking a question is especially useful for coming up with creative ideas to problems. I read an article by Nelson Normal Group that does a lot of ideation work, and they really recommend this way of asking questions. How might we? If your goal is to brainstorm and together come up with potential creative solutions, it really encourages people to start thinking in interesting ways. So the reason why this way of asking the question achieves this is because it really encourages others to chime in. It says that we are all participating in planning out a solution to this problem. And it also says you're not on your own. I'm here as well. We're going to tackle this together. How might we? This is collaborative framing. Consider another question that is trying to plan a solution to a particular problem. This question says, how might we train people to not click on phishing links? So the starting point is good, right? It's that collaborative framing that is hopefully going to come up with creative solutions. But a challenge with many questions that we ask is that we already presuppose a particular type of a solution by defining the problem too narrowly. Look at this question. What is the underlying issue that we're trying to solve here? Is it indeed our goal to solve the problem of people not clicking on links? Because people are going to click. That's just what people do. Maybe it is more constructive to think about the underlying issue a bit more broadly. And maybe we can rephrase this question to say something like, how might we mitigate the risk of phishing attacks? You see, now we broadened the framing of this question, and now we might come up with solutions that actually might work. And maybe a part of the solution will be lowering the rate of clicking on suspicious links, but now we can include in the planning of the solution other type of security measures, be it email filtering or browser security controls. So sometimes we ask questions too narrowly, and we need to broaden our framework. But sometimes the framing can be too broad. For example, let's say you're asking the question, is the security agent on all the endpoints? This question, is it on all endpoints, maybe is not specific enough, because if somebody says yes, does that really mean that your security control, that your security question, your security concern is addressed? Because it's possible that the agent software is installed, but it's not working. Or maybe it's working, but it's not communicating with the management server. Or maybe it's there, but it's not properly configured. So sometimes we ask questions too broadly. And when is the right way to ask a question in a particular manner? Well, you just need to think about this. You need to look at your question and see how will the other party perceive it. Will they answer it very directly, and will that truly give you the answer to everything you want to know about the situation? Sometimes we need to broaden the framing of the question. Sometimes we need to be more specific. So how are we thinking about questions that can help us with planning? What I suggested with you is to include language in the beginning of your question that, well, it's an inclusive framing is what I suggested to you. Using the word we to share the sense of ownership over the answer so that the person knows that you're there to help them, and so that other participants in the situation feel welcomed to chime in with their answers. How might we, this way of asking the question, really encourages collaboration to come up with creative solutions. Also, I suggested that you are careful about not having preconceived assumptions hard-coded into the question. Sometimes you need to broaden the scoping of your question to make sure that you come up with meaningful answers and don't solve a problem that's very narrow, that doesn't actually address the underlying risk. And sometimes I said that your questions framing can be a bit too broad and might require some specific sub or follow-up questions, perhaps. The next set of activities I wanted to discuss with you involves how you engage with others by asking questions when you're trying to be persuasive. This, for me, is perhaps the hardest aspect of working in cybersecurity. I need to persuade others to pay attention to what it is I'm trying to say, to address the risks in a particular way, to follow the recommended course of action that I've put together. Oftentimes, we need to get buy-in from other stakeholders in the security projects. We need to defend our security budget requests by persuading the decision makers. We need to persuade perhaps our customers so they can trust us in our security program. And we need to persuade those who ask us for approval to risky actions, that maybe the action is too risky to be taken. So let's look at some examples. Consider a situation where somebody asks you to approve something that you as a security professional think is just too risky. And your answer is, I cannot approve this security request. How might the other person see you and perceive your answer? Well, of course, nobody likes hearing a rejection. They will not like it when you disagree. And look, sometimes you have enough political power in the organization to simply say no, and that'll be the end of it. But usually security professionals don't have that much power. Instead, we need to persuade others that our point of view is valid, useful, and worth agreeing with. So the key here is to cause the other party to understand our point of view. To be persuasive, try to see if the other party can understand your perspective. But it's a very hard thing to do, because how can you force somebody else to empathize with you? That can be a hard thing to do. If only there was a way to force empathy. And there might be a way by asking questions in a particular way. Here, in this situation, how might you rephrase the question so that the other person is likely to think about it from your perspective? Well, here's my suggestion. You might say something like, how can I approve your request while staying consistent with our approach to risk management? How can I approve your request? Now, the other person, if they're paying attention, if they're paying any attention to what you're saying, now they're starting to think about it from your perspective. You have caused them to empathize with you, because now they need to think like a security professional. How can I approve your request while staying consistent with our approach to risk management? Notice the word "our" here also introduces collaborative framing as well. So if you want to say no, do so using this way of framing your question, cause the other person to think about the problem from your perspective. And this I learned by reading a book by Chris Voss, who was a former FBI negotiator. And his favorite way of asking questions as a way of saying no is to simply say, how am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to do it? Somebody asks you to do something that's risky, and by simply saying, how am I supposed to do that? Or how can I do this without exposing our organization to undue risk, that causes the other person to empathize with you? And of course, you need to include other advice that I shared with you when asking your question, like collaborative framing, for example. But look, this is perhaps a more effective way of interacting with others than simply saying no. Forced empathy, if that's even a thing, can help you here. Let's look at another example. What might be a stronger way to defend your security budget request? Let's say your budget request was not fully approved. You wanted to get some funding for, I don't know, a penetration test, and that request was rejected. What might you say? You could say, why was my request for funding rejected? Why? That might not always be effective. It turns out, just from experience, maybe you'll agree, I don't know, people get a little bit defensive when you ask them why. Like you're calling them out, and this elevates the tension in the room sometimes. So I prefer not to start my questions with why. In this case, to better understand why your funding request was rejected, so that presumably you can react to it, maybe ask the other party to reconsider, or make sure that the other party understands the repercussions of the denial. You could phrase your question in a way that speaks to a shared objective. Here's how you might rephrase the previous question. You might say, our need for the penetration test was driven directly by our customers' requirements. How will we meet their expectations without the penetration test? So now I'm causing the other party to see the situation from my perspective. I'm using inclusive framing with the word we, but I'm also speaking to shared objectives, because presumably in a given organization, we all want our customers to succeed. We need to support their requests. And if that request for a penetration test came from your customers, how will we meet their expectations? Maybe this will start the conversation for perhaps including some extra funding, even though it was initially denied. Or maybe this will lead to some other way of addressing the underlying need that you perhaps even haven't thought of. So think about shared objectives, especially when you want to connect and resonate with colleagues outside of the security or the IT organization, speak to shared business needs. I mean, as security professionals, we like to talk about threats and vulnerabilities and risks, but that kind of language doesn't always work with other colleagues. Think about shared objectives. Rephrase your questions to bring those up in your conversations. Something else I wanted to mention to you, when I'm dealing with a situation where I'm hoping to get approval for something. And so I might say something like, are you okay with the latest revision to my security policy? Now here I'm talking about something that is a little bit subtle, so I'm not sure if you will agree. But what I have learned through some books and experience is that people oftentimes are worried about saying yes. Saying yes is a commitment, and sometimes they will say yes just so that you stop bothering them, even though they don't necessarily mean yes. So sometimes it's easier to get buy-in by rephrasing your question so that the answer that you want is no. What does that mean? How might you rephrase this question so that the answer that I want to hear is a no? How about something like this? Do you have any concerns with the security policy before I finalize it? In this case, I hope the answer will be, nope, everything's fine. It's easier for people to say no. So sometimes I rephrase my questions so that for the person to agree with me, they say no. And look, people don't always agree with me, of course not. And here I will remind you that even if they do say no and you're looking for a yes, that's not always immediate rejection. That could be seen as the start of a negotiation and a conversation that you'll be having with all the other ways of asking questions to get their buy-in eventually, hopefully. So my takeaways for how to ask questions when you try to persuade involve phrasing your questions in a way that causes the other person to think about the situation from your perspective, forcing empathy on them. Bringing in shared objectives, going beyond threats and vulnerabilities to perhaps talk about business goals, and thinking about asking your questions so that the answer you seek is no, because maybe it's easier for somebody to say no, and maybe when they say yes, they don't truly mean yes. So the next steps for you, if you like what you have heard so far, review these materials again. And for every type of activity that we covered, think about a question you can ask somebody related to your projects at work right now. How can you ask those questions? When can you ask them? And how might you rephrase them to incorporate the advice that I shared with you? That's my challenge to you. Those are the next steps you might want to take. And if you want to learn more about this topic, then Google the various articles that I have based my advice on when researching this topic. You will find them online. And so I thank you for paying attention to this, and I'm looking forward to your feedback regarding these ideas. You can easily find me online.